Hello everyone, my name's Neil Haddon and I'm currently the Associate Head of Art here at the School of Creative Arts and Media. Today we're meeting across Lutruwita, Tasmania on Aboriginal land, sea and waterways and online. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people, and all First Nations peoples on the lands where you find yourselves. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. This is not a statement about history, it's a statement about lived reality now. Consequently, I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal justice, perspectives, culture, language and history, paving the way for a strong future. Now, before we get into today's speaker, who I'll introduce in a second, I just want to spruik, if I can, the Rosamund McCulloch studio. Have any of you in the room heard of the Rosamund McCulloch studio? Yeah, a few hands going up. Yeah, lots of nods and hands up. If you didn't know, it's a residential studio in the world-renowned Cité Internationale des Arts complex in Paris and a short walk from many of the city's major museums. Each year, the University of Tasmania offers several residencies at the studio, which is situated in a beautiful 18th century townhouse close to the main Cité complex, and I suspect we're going to see some images of that. Since its establishment in 1991, many Tasmanian artists have had the opportunity to live in the heart of Paris while studying and developing new work. The residencies are also supported by the $10,000 Mary Maxwell Travel Scholarship, the $3,000 Marie Edwards Travelling Scholarship, and the $4,000 Wayne Brooks Visual Art Travel Prize. Applications will be opening soon, and creative Tasmanians, including visual artists, musicians, performers and writers who are graduates of the University of Tasmania, are encouraged to apply. Why am I talking about this today? Well, because now I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Tony Flowers. Tony is an internationally acclaimed illustrator and artist, creator of over 50 books. His works are renowned for their vivid imagery and compelling narratives, often inspired by his travels and keen dedication to cultural exploration. Tony's received awards for his work, notably the prestigious Iguchi Banshu Prize at the Oshima International Handmade Picture Book Awards in Toyama, Japan, for his handmade pop-up book, Keijin Holiday, and also, most notably, the Rosamund McCulloch Residency. Tony's latest project, Divi and Frey and the Eye of Anubis, was created whilst he immersed himself in the Parisian life during his residency. Delving further into Egyptian heritage through on-ground experiences, Tony wove the richness of these cultural landscapes into a graphic novel narrative that transports readers from Paris's enchanting architecture to the timeless mysteries of Egypt's ancient monuments. How great. Please join me in welcoming Tony Flowers.
Just changing presentations, people. Well, first of all, thanks for coming along. I can see a few familiar faces, some past students who I would have thought had seen enough of me in their time here and wouldn't really want to come and hear me talk about anything ever again after I've had to deliver weeks and weeks of content and assess them. There we go. Perfect. Today, I really want to go through a little bit about the development of my graphic novel, Divi and Frey, and how I incorporate travel and lived experience as a part of developing narratives and also as a part of just my whole creative process. I'm, like many people, an avid fan of travel and exploration, and I do love delving into other cultures as much as possible. Before we get too far into it, I should say the window there that I'm sitting in is at the Cité Internationale, and that is the Rosamund McCulloch studio. And I was there 2 years ago in winter, hence I'm sitting on top of a radiator with the window open. It was very nice, it was a lovely place, but it was a bit cold in winter, so pick your time carefully. We can discuss that more. To understand sort of what I was doing in Paris and how I got to write graphic novels, you sort of have to think, you don't just launch yourself into graphic novels. I've been working as an illustrator for over 20 years. In that time, as Neil mentioned, I've illustrated over 50 books, and these have allowed me to have all sorts of interesting experiences. Quite notably, one of the great benefits of working in children's publishing is you get to go to lovely festivals all over the country where you get to meet other illustrators and creative people. And you discover that it's a very nurturing community. We're always interested to see what we're doing, what the next project is, and we get tips from each other. But I didn't start life as an illustrator. I left the University of Tasmania as a graduate diploma way back in the 90s, where I was working a couple of days a week throughout my graduate diploma as a glassblower at Tasmanian Glassblowers. I went by one day, saw the guy pulling out molten glass from the furnace and thought that looks interesting, because at the time I was working in ceramics and I could see how the two fields related. It was that 3D sculptural form that I loved. And then I really got sucked into this world of hot molten glass. It's a dance with the glass, we used to call it. You don't actually touch the glass with your hands. Well, I've got a few scars to show that sometimes you do. But it's by controlling the glass in a certain way, you end up with the shape you want, and the less you do, the more beautiful the object is. It was an interesting time in life because I went through my education with my parents, or my mum, and lots of my family members saying to me, don't be an artist. Your uncle's an artist and he doesn't make much money. Your brother's an artist, he doesn't make much money. And I didn't think I was very good at drawing. So I grew up with these older brothers that could all draw and cousins that went off to animate for Disney and all sorts of things. And along the way, I was always drawing anyway, just for the fun and pleasure of it. It wasn't until about this time when I realised I actually got to a stage as a glassblower where I'd learned a very technical skill at a very high level, and then looked back at my illustration work and thought, actually, my illustrations aren't bad. It's just when I was growing up in primary school, I was comparing myself to someone who was in grade 12. When I left high school, I was comparing myself to someone who was in the early 20s and already here at the art school. So I'd never given myself any sort of fair comparison. So I suddenly realised that maybe drawing isn't too bad. Maybe I can actually do something with my drawing in the future, because I'd always loved narrative and illustration. When I was doing my graduate diploma, I remember we had to do a presentation at uni on the artists that inspire us. And the sculptors would get up the front and they'd have Peter Goldsworthy and all these other sculptors, and then the painters would bring up all these amazing painters, both conceptual and classical. And I got up and put up Sergio Aragonés, who, if you've ever read a Mad comic and seen the little illustrations around the margins, he is the illustrator of those. And I also put up a guy called Frank Miller, who is now very well known because he directed a lot of movies like 300 and Sin City. But back then was unknown of, and I was pretty much laughed out of the auditorium by half of the people because they couldn't understand why it was an art form. You know, they had a lovely term back then. It was like, oh, you're just prostituting your art form to make money. It's like, oh, it's not about making money, it's about expressing myself with story. So I had a period of time where, for various reasons, I couldn't glassblow anymore. So I decided to look at illustration as a potential option. I was very lucky in that my first attempts to move into this area was met with some success. But I very quickly discovered one of the things that I really loved about illustration was the research. So whenever I do a new picture book, and I've done quite a few now, I like to delve deeply into the research side of the process. A title I worked on recently was Grandma's First Tattoo. Throughout the process, I would ask everyone I saw with a tattoo about the tattoo and the story behind it. And this is my wonderful niece, Hannah, who was also a student here for a while, who now lives just out of Edinburgh in Dundee and is one of the top 100 tattoo artists in the world. This is me getting my cat tattooed on my arm and understanding that I'm really glad I've only got one tattoo because they hurt. They hurt a lot. But I learnt stuff through that process that I incorporated into my illustrations. You can see the image on the far left where the image isn't fully coloured. That gave me this idea for using lots of negative space throughout my illustrations, because the more I looked at tattoos, the more I realised that control of negative and positive space was a really big thing for the visual storytelling of tattoos and how they create their images. So I've always loved this idea of getting into the research side of things as much as possible. For a book I did on the First World War called This Old Thing, I spent hours going through the online archives of the National War Memorial, and I've got a fully sort of academic cited research document that teachers love because it goes through and shows where every item in the book came from. It sounds like it might stifle creativity if you do this, but it doesn't. It allows me to understand the world and be free within that world to create the stories, because these are the things that are in the background that bring authenticity to the work. So the story of Divi and Frey is an adventure story. And when I was applying for the scholarship, I had to come up with a reason for going to Paris. What's your project going to be about? And I sort of quickly thought about all the projects I had on my drawing board that I haven't actually realised yet. And the one that suited Paris the most was this adventure graphic novel story about a consultant detective who solves mysteries based around the theft of archaeological items. And I knew Paris had a pretty strong link with Egyptian culture. It's probably not apparent to a lot of people who don't think about it very much, but if you look into the Louvre, they've got an amazing collection because there was a lot of French explorers going down through Egypt in the early 1900s. You walk around Paris, you will see the obelisks outside of the Louvre, you'll see sphinxes everywhere, and there's all sorts of buildings adorned with Egyptian gods like Hathor and other imagery. So it's a pretty nice connection because I love Egypt, and I thought, I can sneak in that Egyptian side. So one of my valid reasons for going to Paris was to look at the Parisian collection of Egyptian artefacts at the Louvre and select one of those being the catalyst for the story. Something is going to be stolen from the Louvre or on the way to the Louvre, and our main character gets called in. This is me sitting in good old Le Peloton Cafe, which is just a short walk from the studio, and it boasts having one of the few good flat white coffees in Paris. As an addict of coffee, it has a flat white coffee. Let's just say it's not one of the best flat whites you'll ever have, but you'll survive if you're an addict like me. And it gives you it's a lovely space to work. I have this habit, which is every morning I go to a coffee shop and I sit down and draw. And the reason I do that is because as a freelance illustrator, as a person who's self-motivated, you need some sort of routine. Well, I do. And for me, an hour to an hour and a half drawing every morning is a big chunk of drawing. It would be for most people if they were to sit and draw for an hour and a half a day. That's just me starting my day. I have my uni work to do, but as well, I would probably draw on average probably about 4 hours a day. If I've got a deadline that's looming, maybe that goes up to about 12 to 13, 14 hours a day. But luckily, I'm still sitting around that 5 to 6 hours a day ratio at the moment. So my morning coffee is really important. The other thing about my morning coffee in France was my wife sleeps longer than I do, and she was travelling with me. So she'd sleep in, I'd go down and have my flat white and do an hour's drawing, and then she'd rock up and get her flat white and croissant, s'il vous plaît, and then all of a sudden she was happy because she was eating fresh croissants and we'd have a good start to the day. Also, because I was in Paris, I didn't want to just be sitting in cafes all day. I was walking around and exploring. They do this wonderful thing when you turn up at the Cité. They give you a little ID card, and it's like an art inspector's license. It's a photo ID of you that gets stamped, and it's an artist pass, and you get to go into all sorts of museums and galleries for free. So you rock up to a gallery, you flip your artist card up and say, art inspector, and then through you go. It doesn't work at all of the galleries, not at the Louvre, but it does at the Musée d'Orsay, also the Picasso Gallery, and all these other wonderful venues around Paris. So it's one of those things where you're always wanting to be out and exploring, and you're in a very exciting city, so you don't want to be sitting still in the one location all the time. So I walked around a lot while I was in Paris. One of the things I noted was the cobblestones, the lovely ironwork, just the general streetscape feeling, which starts to enrich the stories that I'm working on. I also had a bit of fun exploring some of the more touristy sites. I didn't really want, and I don't ever want in any of my books, for them to feel like they're postcards. So it's not about, okay, now we're going to go to the Eiffel Tower, now we're at the Arc de Triomphe. It doesn't happen in the books. If there's not a reason for your story to be in a location, it's gone. We don't just do things for the superfluous fun of it. In my story, there's an electronic pulse device that gets off and goes off towards the end and will threaten most of Paris. So we had to introduce the idea to younger readers that if you dampen electronic signal by putting it underground, it might be the solution to solving the problem. Because when the solution comes up, I don't want it to be a complete surprise conceptually for my reader. So here we are in the Paris catacombs, where we come across some nefarious characters doing bad things, but this rather hopeless character tries to ring back to headquarters to report. Unfortunately, he's underground and can't get a signal through, and this is pointed out to him, hence pre-priming my readers later on for the solution to the story. But places like the catacombs are fascinating. You know, they're kind of the places that people talk about when they go to Paris. I went to Paris, oh, did you go to the catacombs? It's something that people often say in hushed tones. It's like a really interesting sort of social response to an overcrowding problem they had. And it's quite a fascinating place from an artistic perspective to see what everyday people do when presented with what a lot of people might think are macabre and morbid things. You can start to see in the image on the bottom over on the left, they were doing things like making love hearts into the walls with the skulls and cross patterns and all sorts of interesting patterning out of the bones just because of the way they stacked, and because obviously they were a little bit bored to start with, but then had a different aesthetic eye for what we might have today. But it was quite fascinating, but it forms an interesting background for a story. Again, it's not the main feature of the story, it's just a background location. But without locations like this, you sort of lose some of the richness of the story. Another part of that exploring locations is I go and I don't know what the story is going to fully be. I've got an idea, I sketch lots of moments and sections of my adventures while I'm there, and they naturally weave together to become a story. I had to throw the Eiffel Tower in just so people knew it was Paris that I'd been to. But when travelling, I was trying to find that solution for the electronic pulse device. I was thinking, where can I go underground? Where can they take this device? And then just before Christmas, I went on a canal ride down the Saint-Martin Canal, which goes from the suburbs of Paris down through underground tunnels under the Bastille, and then comes out on the Seine, and then you go up past the Eiffel Tower, and then on a little bit further to the Statue of Liberty, then turn around and come back. And I thought when I was going through the Bastille tunnels, this is visually dramatic, this is interesting, it's underground, my electronic device can go off here and it will have minimal damage. How am I going to get the electronic device into this part of the tunnel? Will they have to steal a boat or a barge, or they're going to sort of rush it there to dampen the explosion? And I've also got a bit of a quirky sort of affection for mid-century useless car designs, micro cars and other weird cars. There is a 1960s car called an Ampi car. It was designed in Britain and is an interesting car because it drives on land and also turns into a boat. So it's kind of a quirky thing that I've liked for many years, and I thought, oh, it'd be great if I could do an Ampi car, but that would be ridiculous because this is modern day Paris. There'd be no way I could put an Ampi car in and have it be believable. On that same trip, as I'm heading up past the Eiffel Tower, on their way to the Statue of Liberty, there on the back of a giant barge on the side of the river Tied up is a little red amphicar on the back of the barge, obviously for their day trips whenever they pull up in Lyon or wherever the canals take them. I thought, great, permission. I can use that amphicar, but I'm going to have to change it to yellow because my main character always wears a red jacket to make them visually locatable within the images. So these are a couple of the rough sketches that I've put together for that idea and that scene, just thinking about how it might start to look and come together. It's a nice way to sort of go somewhere, because when you're traveling with your character. So when I'm going around the streets of Paris, I'm just thinking, how would my character react to this? Or how would this other character react to this situation? Or what could be a surprise and delight point? One of the characters, Divi and Frey are the two main characters. Frey is my dog Freya, and she is in the story so that she can have this innocent response to something that's either ridiculous or amazing, that childlike wonder. So I'm always looking for those childlike moments of wonder. What's something that you find that delights you? So here's some of my other sketches for that lovely little amphicar. You'll also see just on the left there, someone falling down some stairs on a scooter. I was quite impressed by all the subways around Paris. That particular one is Pont Marie, which is the Cité's subway, right out the front of the main building. And just that idea of, if you're in Paris, what calamity can happen. And luckily, you're in a busy city, so you see calamity happening on a daily basis, because it's a place. When I was there in December, it was really nice. There's not many tourists around. It was just pretty much Parisians wandering around, because it was a bit cold and not a peak season. But then come the 20th of December, when people decided to be in Paris for Christmas, the place got choked. And you could see people stepping out in front of cars and tripping over things. And for a storyteller, that's gold. You just look for those moments. What are the hazards that most people don't see? What are things that could happen to you while you're in Paris? So it starts to feed that vision. Things as simple as creating a crepe Suzette, it can be a point of fascination. So we've all heard crepe Suzettes, but unless you've seen one made in front of you in a little Parisian bistro, you don't understand how beautifully theatric it is. So over on the right, we can see a bit of our crepe Suzette creator there. She's a document with some photographs. I do some drawings. By the end of my coffee and lunch there, I gave her also an illustration of her creating a crepe Suzette. So she had that as well. It's the type of thing that can just be the background image for a narrative, because a lot of narrative in graphic novel format is text heavy to drive the narrative. So whilst that heavy text is going on driving the plot, it's nice to have something lighter happening in the background that's happenstance. So two characters talking over each other, and in the background between the two characters, the dog is licking its lips, looking at the crepe Suzette being created. I threw in the extra picture here because I thought it's nice to realise that you're in Paris, but you also have access to Europe, all of Europe, and what a wonderful place it is. In this particular case, this is still France. This is up in Bayeux. I went to see the Bayeux Tapestry. An amazing experience, a beautiful medieval town, but just being able to go and look at things that you've heard about all your life or experience the wonders of walking around medieval French villages. It's quite a privilege, but also we travelled further. We travelled into Belgium a fair bit. We went up through Ghent and on to Bruges, and then my wife went off to London with a mate, and I went down further south below Brussels, and I went to the Tintin Museum to see Hergé's work, which was incredible. Some people might think Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel might be their ultimate goal. Tintin for we illustrators would probably be the equivalent of. So it's great when you've got access to all these things, and you can just start to plan your journey, and also what are things that are going to inspire you, and you look for those opportunities. When you're sitting in your studio in France, you've got a fair bit of time to go, how far away is Bayeux? Oh, should we go to Saint-Montcharret? Should we look at these other locations? And you just go, I can't get to that one, but I can get to this one. And it's just sort of a really great opportunity when you have something that you want to do as a practice, where you can explore in a way that we can't sometimes when we're in Australia or here in Tasmania even, because we can't just instantly jump in a car and be in Sydney or Brisbane. There's a freedom that comes from being in such a place. This is the pin-up wall in the studio. So this is some of the work that I'd completed whilst there. I was only in the studio for a month, so I didn't have much time to draw. Accompanying this is a number of sketchbooks. I've got a few here, if anyone wants to look through them. But as I said, it's about capturing those moments that could feature in the narrative or drive a narrative or create a plot solution. And the story, as I was travelling around, started to crystallise in my mind. And all I knew was I had to get to the Louvre because I really needed to go to the Egyptian collection to find some amazingly beautiful artefact that I could create as a central piece of what gets stolen. So I headed off to the Louvre, and it was a wonderful day, getting lost and walking kilometres and kilometres, as you do. That's just within the Louvre itself, let alone getting there. And I was looking through all the most beautiful Egyptian artefacts they had there. They had turquoise and sort of inlaid golden necklaces, they had sarcophaguses, they had stone caps for pyramids with gold on them. The amount of sculptures and artefacts there were incredible. But just as I was about to leave, the last cabinet on the way out, there was one small item, which was this eyepiece. This is item AF11811, and if you type in AF11811 and the Louvre collection, you will get a reference image that looks like this, which is important for me because my audience, I like to foster curiosity in my audience. And a lot of my audience is very young because my books are aimed at primary school age children to grade 7, 8. So grade 5 to grade 8 is about the sweet spot for the graphic novel. I want those kids to be able to go, AF11811, that sounds like a fake number, let's type it in. They Google it, they're going to find it. Then they're going to go, oh, it's real. So in the description, which was all in French, my Google Translates told me, because my French is très terrible, it told me that it was an eyepiece of unknown origin made of stone and metal believed to be from a sarcophagus. I hadn't actually been to Egypt at this stage. I was just looking at this piece thinking, wow, that's pretty amazing. It's an alabaster stone, which is a white stone. And then the bit in the middle is what fascinated me. Because as a storyteller, I'm thinking, there's something missing and they don't know where it came from. There's opportunity there for story. There's opportunity there for exploration. So luckily, about a year later, I found myself in Egypt, still with that eyepiece in my brain going, oh, let's look for this eyepiece. And then I quickly found that the eyepiece might be from a sarcophagus, but it was more likely coming from a wooden sculpture. The big image on the right and the lower one on the left are both made of wood. And the Egyptians did these lovely wooden sculptures, and what they do is they inlay these metal eyes, and the inside iris of the eye should be a crystal. And again, I'm just thinking, the crystal in the middle, and I sort of start thinking about my time as a glassblower. And one thing when you're someone like a glassblower that you know about is refraction of light and the potential for infusing colour and filters through the glass. So I'm starting to think, what if the centre of the eyepiece had a particular lens that had a refractive quality between the two lenses, was prismic, and also had a colour tint on it, and then allow you, in a story, to see hidden hieroglyphics written on a wall because they're done in a certain ink or paint. Ah, great, story plot idea. So the eyepiece was going to be the main thing stolen. They want the one from the Louvre, but they're going to steal one on the way to the Louvre, which is where the whole story starts. The main character gets called in to solve the case of an eyepiece being delivered from the museum in Cairo to the Louvre for scientists to examine. And as you can see on the right, that's the whole story. So now you know it. That's what it looks like. So when I write my stories, I start with a visual summary. So I've done lots of sketches by this stage, and I start to plot it and think about what's the flow through this story? How's this story going to work? What are the mechanics? And I don't expect anyone to follow or understand that sketch, because that sketch is for me. That's for me to go through. This bit works, this bit doesn't work. I need to add more here. I like this little bit, I can expand it. So it's a way of me just noting down some of the key beats in the story, and then I can start to plot that story out and write it. But what's interesting to me is the fact that it was my career as a glassblower, and the last little insignificant item that wasn't the golden capstone of a major pyramid was the biggest inspiration, because I could see those two creative worlds collide. And it's the fact that no matter what you do in life, and I've had lots of different careers along the way to help support my creative career, but whatever you do, you gain experience and you gain understanding of how things can come together and can be used. Whether it's to create a sculpture or a painting or a drawing, or if you're writing a story, an illustration or a narrative. So for me, I live in the world of narrative. So I'm always looking for those story ideas. So the glass eye became the driving force, and a whole story then started to unfold. So of course, there was only one thing to do, and that was to start plotting out the story to see how it was going to go. I should say, I had the rough premise for the story, not the story written, before I went to Paris. Just before going to Paris, I received word from my publisher, Walker Books, that they were going to offer me a contract for the story, sight unseen, based on the premise alone. So I knew I was into an interesting story idea, but then I had to write it down so that they could actually see what the story was, because I can talk underwater, but maybe what I say and what you see in your brain are two different things. So you have to start storyboarding and writing the text out. So you can see the eyepiece in the top right, but then you've got the rough sketch for how that eyepiece looked in the Louvre, and then you've got the more finished artwork on the left there. These are panels for a book. So this panel will end up being 5.5 centimetres high. So the detail gets condensed, and the width of it gets adjusted depending on, and cropped depending on how it sits on the frame sits on the page, and how it flows with the image next to it, and how the text sits across the image. But you can see the story from the storyboard is, we talk about the eye, we're talking to Divi and this strange character in the middle, it's the museum director, and then they talk about the backstory for where the eye came from, which part of Egypt it was, and then we have to find out a bit about that. So there has to be some backstory sort of fill-in sections to my story, and the only way to sort of do that properly was to run around and find the locations in Paris. So the passage of Cairo, or Carrère, in Paris. This is an interesting apartment block adorned with images of Hathor. And then, of course, you head off to Egypt, because that's just what you've got to do. I headed off to Egypt in November last year, specifically with this book project in mind. I spend all my time when I'm traveling around somewhere like Egypt, because I can't carry all my art materials with me, with a couple of palettes of watercolour, about 2 or 3 sketchbooks, and a bunch of watercolour paper that all compacts down into a small size so it can fit into a backpack. Take lots of reference photos, and then when I'm sitting down in the evening, I do drawings, or if I'm sitting down at lunch, I do some more drawings. This is probably the most touristy postcard view I've taken a picture of, which is, of course, the Great Pyramids behind. I was going there to find the more undiscovered and the more or less thought about aspects of being in Egypt, and also try to understand their way of storytelling, connect with the people, trying to understand their approach to narrative, what's been done in ancient Egypt, how the history all comes together. So it's very lucky. Throughout the entire tour, I had Egyptologists coming along with me to different locations and explaining the hieroglyphs and what they meant. I could talk to them about my story, and then they could go through this process of saying, oh yes, if you look at the hieroglyphs here, you can see that's exactly what's happening as you're explaining your story. So I take those moments like the camel ride and then convert those into images where we start to look at how camels saddled. What are the blankets like? How are they tied? How do they move? I've never ridden a camel before. What's it like? A bit like, I don't know, riding a washing machine sitting on top of a unicycle in the end. It's quite an interesting experience. But just understanding how it all comes together so you can build an image that starts to make sense to an audience and tells a story and builds excitement and adventure. This particular image goes across a double page, it goes across a single page at the top, takes up 2 rows, and has a big text block up in the left-hand side, hence it's left blank, which will introduce that chapter. Chapter 2, The Egyptologist, and it gives its location. Luckily for me, the motorcycle riding, well, I ride a motorbike. There's me just out of, what's it called, Wadi El Rayyan, one of the only waterfalls in Egypt. So I like to incorporate things like motor vehicles in my illustrations because they add that sense of movement and adventure, but also because I like motorbikes. So I rode here this morning. I rode motorcycles all the time. Of course, I used to ride old motorcycles. They always fell apart, so I had to repair them. So I kind of know all the components well enough in my brain to draw them without too much reference. But it is nice to do references to see the style of motorcycle. Before I went to Egypt, I drew the image up on the right of the Triumph Scrambler with the girl riding along. Now I've been to Egypt, I'll probably draw more of a low-key bike like this and make it feel much more natural to the environment. Because whoever rides this Scrambler has lots of money, and there's probably about 5 in the country, whereas there's about 1 million of the little red ones buzzing all over Cairo and all over the country. So a part of that getting authentic feeling into the story is to understand what has been used in the environment. If I was drawing cars in the background, I'd use Peugeot 504s from the mid-70s because they are the taxi cab of Egypt. They're everywhere. It's just understanding that as a perspective is really important, and you can't fully understand and appreciate it when you're not there or haven't seen what's going on the streets. For me, I want anyone from Egypt who picks up this book going, this feels like Egypt. This person's been here. Oh, this feels like Paris. This person's been here. I don't want people to go, that looks like a postcard. That feels like they've made it up through Google searches. Anyone can do a Google search, but you'll never find out the depth that you need unless you go to places. So here are some of the resulting images to go into the book. I know that my Egyptologist friends now in Egypt will be able to read the hieroglyphs on the walls because the hieroglyphs are all based on hieroglyphs that I saw in temples and tombs. For example, on the right-hand side, the larger image, you can see a really rough sketch of someone standing on top of another animal. This is the god Anubis. It's actually not a god, it's a priest presenting themselves as a god. And they're wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is a symbol of power, such as the staff that they're holding. It has prongs on the end of it because it's holding down Hathor, the devourer of hearts, below him and showing his governance over the world above and the underworld. And I find these things out because the Egyptologists walk around and show me all the hieroglyphs and say, oh, this is what this image means. This is the story behind this. And I love that type of stuff, so I soak it in. And I just find it fascinating when you're in those spaces, the way it feels to be underground, the dampness of the stone, even though it's a really dry climate, it feels oppressive and damp, even though it's not. It's kind of a weird mix because the Nile flooded so often. There's water damage everywhere, but not a drop of water in the atmosphere. And you can see that damage coming through. And places like the left-hand image, the crack coming through with part of the sandstone coming off. That's what makes it feel like you're in Egypt, because it's not beautiful and pristine. If you ever see Tintin's Cigars of the Pharaoh, there's an image where Tintin's walking down a corridor on the cover inside a pyramid or somewhere, and there's all these sphinxes lined, not sphinxes, sarcophaguses lined up across the wall. Sarcophagus were funeral burial boxes. They were laid down. They were never displayed in that way. That's how museums displayed them. As brilliant as Hergé was, he did all of his research through the Google of the day, which was magazines, newspaper articles, travel brochures. He didn't travel that widely. He travelled around parts of Europe, but not around the Middle East or through Northern Africa like he looked like he might have if you looked at his books. So it's simple little cultural things like that which are jarring to the Egyptian audience or to anyone who's been through Egypt. And a lot of people have been through Egypt, so I want to try and make it feel as normal and natural as possible, including what looks like distressed rocks and textures that have got a sense of uncleanliness to them or dirt or dust, because that's all a part of the joy and the charm. This is Mr. Shady Hamdi. He was one of my tour guides and Egyptologists out of Cairo, and this day we'd just been down to Memphis and seen the great colossus of Ramses II, which was rather impressive. And he spent time explaining how hieroglyphics were read. And so he had no idea what I was going on about when I said I'm an artist. So over lunch, I did this drawing of him explaining how the hieroglyphics are read, but in hieroglyphics it says Tony. And he goes, "Oh wow, you can write in hieroglyphics." I said, "Well, you gave me a hieroglyphic key, so I can now write in hieroglyphics. Just phonetically, that's easy." But Shady was a really good guy, and what happens in places like Egypt, because tourism is such a big industry, if you want to be a tour guide, you have to be an Egyptologist. An Egyptologist has to go to university and study for 4 years, and then when they finish, they have to go to the Minister of Culture and sit an exam, and then they have to go sit a personality and English proficiency test or language proficiency test for their chosen language to prove that they're going to be good representatives of Egypt. Hence, there's about 4,000 qualified Egyptologists registered in Egypt. And they have to get professional drivers and all sorts of things to help you along the way. Otherwise, you can't go into certain tombs. Quite often you get big bus trips of these, with the tour guide up the front. We were very lucky. It was just my wife and I, the driver, and Shady, or Muhammad Hamdi was another one of my drivers and guides. So we had these, all over Egypt, we had these lovely people that love sharing their culture. So it was great fun. And when they saw our interest in their culture and what we were doing, they loved it even more, and they would cater and show us things. "Oh, you might like this, Tony. Most tourists don't see this." And they take you to come down this way, and you go down a little corridor, and they say, "Oh, this is a really beautiful thing, but it's not flashy enough for most tourists, but you'll like it." And there'll be a little hole you look through, and inside the hole is a sculpture that gets hidden. But on a certain day of the year, the moon comes over in a calendar, and that's when that statue looks up through the hole at the moon constellation that relates to that god or character. So there's all these little things that build the mythos of Egypt and the storytelling, and it's really well documented. It's amazing. But to be there is incredible. And then when I draw Cairo, I can now draw Cairo looking beautiful. If I was able to draw the pyramids in the book, Cairo will look like Cairo, as you see in the foreground. These horrible apartment blocks with the rubbish at the base, the dust, the broken down cars. You've still got donkeys and carts walking through sections of Cairo here. And then you've got the Grand Museum and the Great Pyramids of Egypt, of Giza behind you. Because the tapestry of life that makes it rich is the modern and the lived. Otherwise, it's just all a bit superficial. And that's what will make the stories interesting. I was lucky enough that, lucky enough or unlucky enough, I was hoping to go to Jordan, go down to Petra, but that section of my trip got cancelled. So I was lucky enough to spend some extra days in Abydos and Dendera, which were the two highlight temples of my tour, and full of these artefacts. To give you a sense of scale, that middle image, you can see there's 3 segments through that doorway. My head would be lucky to be up to the top of that first segment. These places were colossal. And that blue is paint that's been there, ground up lapis stone for the last 4,500 years. So I don't know about you, but when I apply paint to a surface, I'm pretty sure my paper's going to rot away after a couple of hundred years. These guys put paint on there and 4,500 years later, it's still there. It's just incredible to go to places like this. It can be overwhelming because where do you start? It's so beautiful. And how can you possibly capture any of that in a story? And if you go to draw a scene, how much of that detail do you put into your drawing? And so it's kind of crucial when you're thinking about story, not only to think about where you want it to be and what you want to happen, is this physically possible for me to do this? Am I a good enough illustrator to capture some of this? I'm hoping I am. I haven't got to this part of the story yet, but I'll spend a fair bit of time practicing and drawing and trying to get that stone texture. There's some beautiful little things that happen there which you find out about once you've been. So in that central image at the bottom of the column on the left, you'll see there's some dark shadows where bits of it have been gouged away. And that's where priests would dig out a piece of the stone and give it to travellers about 1,000 years after it was made for good luck. There are other sections where effigies are chiselled off. There'll be this beautiful image below, then there'll be a section above, and all the figures are chiselled off up to about 2 or 3 metres, because that's about how high the ladders went for the Christians, and then above that it was all beautiful and wonderful again. Because the sand came in with the floods and hid all the lower stuff, then the Christians came in and repurposed all these temples as Coptic Christian churches, and as a result they didn't want effigies of other deities on the wall, so they went through and got rid of Anubis and Hathor and Isis. They went through and they just chiselled away at all these amazing monuments. And it's quite sad when you go to places and you see these beautiful works of art that have what look like they've been vandalised. It's obviously the changing of time and culture and cultural perspective, and allowing for the fact that all that happened over a period of about 4,000, 5,000 years. So you can expect a few social norms to change. So I just thought I'd throw a couple of images in here to show you the process. So obviously the storyboarding is that rough sketch below. I've now got the text written. This section is narrated rather than speech bubbled, so the characters aren't talking, it's been talked over, so we can see the discovery of the artefact that gets stolen later on and its significance. And then as an image gets closer and closer to finish with your page, they end up looking more like this. This is still not completed, but it gives you an idea of what that final page will start to look like. You'll see the motorcycle image from earlier down the bottom right. I'll change that out before it gets printed. Make it a grottier bike because it'll be more fun. A bit more rust is what it needs. Another interesting part of this process, one of the reasons I got the contract to do this book, or the offer, before having the story written, was I have this idea for drawing with a warped perspective that creates a 3D optical illusion that happens over 2 pages. So both of these images are of 2 flat sheets of paper, just held at 90-degree angles, and if you view them from a certain angle, because I've stunted foreshortening and perspective happening on one axis, you end up with an optical illusion that gives you a sense of depth and space. This is kind of a really nice drawing technique. It's never been done in a published narrative before. So this will be the first book that's ever been used in for a narrative structure. It's more commonly used in 3D chalk art in the modern context. We're used to seeing chasms falling through roads and people balancing on little edges of things. It's more traditionally used in religious art. So if you travel around Europe and you go into the cathedrals of Italy, you will see this as trompe-l'oeil around that creates corridors that disappear into the distances where there's a stone wall. If you go on into Portugal and places like Sintra with the Penne Palace, they've got plain flat walls that get a treatment like this that makes it look like that they're Corinthian columns all around and vines sculpted into the walls when it's just all optical illusion. So it's kind of an interesting technique, but for me, the thing with the technique is it has to be a storytelling technique. It's used throughout my graphic novel on some big introduction pages for sections so that we get a sense of place and space. Temples are really good for this because there's nice loose structure. The inside of the Paris Opera House would be done like this with nice curving staircases. That would be a bit of a trick. Some of the wrought iron stairs that lead you down into the subways around Pont Marie and onto the Ile will be done like this, as well as the front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. So I've got these moments in the story where I want people to go, right, I really feel like I'm there. It's now integrated into the whole narrative. So it's not just being used as a, here's a trick, look at the trick. It's easy to do a book of tricks, but it's hard to do a book that flows together as a narrative. I'm going to finish up on a few slides because we're going to run out of time very quickly. I was hoping for a few questions, but I'm going to wrap it up. There's a few quick lessons here. One of them is these are the colour palettes on some of my illustrations. A lot of people look at my illustrations and love my colour palettes. They go, wow, these are amazing. Can you do a book of colour palettes? And I say, no. But this comes from a philosophy I have. It was taught to me by an Italian photographer. And he basically said, it doesn't matter if you're doing a portrait of the Queen or a portrait of a toilet. You always use the same level of detail and attention. So every panel in my book has the same level of detail and love. There are no throwaway panels or filler. No filler or killer. And I love doing the colour palette in this way because it's a really great way to just focus my mind and then get into the drawings there. Also, you don't have to travel far for inspiration. This is my dog Frey, also the second main character in the book. You can see on the top left, this is where I've simplified Frey from the big fluffy monster that she is to the simple, sleek dog that appears in the book. And when I travel, I think about things like, oh, over here in Seville, I was in a cafe looking at the wire chairs thinking, how would Frey's fur go in that wire chair? Also, remember, as you move forward, everyone's a critic. Some critics you have to listen to. Some critics you don't. But it's always worth considering everyone's opinion because you don't want to surround yourself with yes people. Oh, everything you do is wonderful. But you also don't want to surround yourself with naysayers. You've got to find those people that can give you critical insight that will let you build and develop as an artist or a storyteller. Freya's a very good critic. If she's a bit bored, she likes to show up my sketchbooks and sometimes my drawings. So where to from here? I've got more books to do. Still got this graphic novel to finish in the next couple of months. I'm planning more travel for upcoming books. I'm off to Japan in November to see Japan in autumn and see some wonderful shrines and temples. It will be my 6th trip, and luckily, Nihongo wa sukoshi dekimasu. I speak enough Japanese to get around, order the right food, and get completely lost and confused. So a bit overconfident, so it should be a fun trip. And that is it. Thank you very much for paying attention. We've got a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Tony. If anyone needs to get away and go to a class, please do jump up and do that. Also, if you're listening online and need to do the same, please do. But for those of you who want to stick around, we do have a couple of minutes if there are any questions. And
I'll be around a bit longer, and I've got some more drawings if you want to look at them. Stunned silence, no question. Oh, questions. Here we go.
Okay, we'll start down here.
Always.
You've heard my questions before. I love the way that you use, that you're really focused on the places you draw being really authentic representation, so they would feel like someone knows that place. Yep, that's that place. It's not a made-up version. It's not a postcard version. It's not a Google search. Yet, within those places, you have these fantastical stories, these characters of something being stolen from the Louvre, things that seem a bit out of place. To me, that's wonderful because it makes it feel like something magic or fantastical could actually happen in the real world. Is that why you allow your characters to be fantastical and your places have to be authentic, or does it give it some other effect for you?
It makes a character that does amazing things even seem more amazing because we believe the world they're in so much. And then we accept the story more readily because we believe the world they're in. If the world they're in is drawn in a jarring way or represented in a jarring way, then we start to question. It's like a movie where we get distracted and go, why do they do that? Well, Where are they? I don't understand where they are. Once that happens, it breaks the spell of the story, and we want to be immersed in the story. This isn't about why did I give you a mark in class, is it? No.
You mentioned that you get overwhelmed when you get to places that have too much detail. So how do you record these places? Do you take photos and then you go back to a cafe and make the detail? And how do you keep the essence of that place? Because there is a different experience of sketching in place and doing it from a photo.
Yeah, there is, but because the experience is lived and I've captured the photos, it gives me an opportunity to not only capture the photo of the space, but also think, when I go to draw this, I'm going to forget that stone head. I'll be lost in the detail. So I go around and take lots of detail photos and situational photos. And I find, I don't know if my brain just works this way, but I can look at pictures of the Saint-Chapelle Chapel near Notre Dame. It was one of those places. It's so overwhelming, you don't know where to focus. And I went to draw it, and it was so overwhelming, I didn't even know where to start drawing it. The patterning was so deep and detailed. But it was, every time I look at the photos, I remember that day with great vivid sort of recall. So I kind of like taking lots of documentary photos, and then the sketches helped me cement those ideas. Okay.
I just had a question because there's a great sense of suspense as we've seen your images and come through all the way 1 hour. What happens at the end?
Oh, do you want the spoiler alert?
Not really.
I won't tell you then.
But you can if you want to.
No, I will tell you this. The difference between a fine artist presenting a single image in a gallery or an exhibition is about an expression of the inner. For me, what I do with my artwork is I have to always tell a story. So my particular skill is I'm not the greatest illustrator in the world, but I am particularly good at bringing characters to life and making a story. So you're always wondering what happens next, the moving, what's going on. And that's a really important skill set for illustrators to have. It doesn't matter if I'm doing stick figures or complex renderings, that still has to be there. Otherwise, there is no story. So I'm glad you get that feeling.
In other words, go and buy the book. Please join me again in thanking Tony.
Thank you very much.